I love memes, and more than I love consuming other people's memes, I love creating my own memes, using me or my family members or coworkers to create that nice, relevant, funny moment for us to have. And in this exercise, I'm going to create a meme which places me inside of a Habitat container. And the fun part is that this little bit of code is eventually, in a follow-up exercise, going to turn into a website that will allow others to specify their image to put inside of a Habitat container. And then eventually we're going to put the website into a Habitat container and then easily deploy it into production. So let's get started. All right, so I'm going to create the Ruby code from scratch that's going to do all of this, and you're going to do this with me. So first and foremost, I'm going to create a directory that allows me to do this. And I'm going to create a gem file that contains the gem that I need to accomplish this work. The only gem that I need for our code is RMagick. Now, RMagick is a gem that's available on rubygems.org. So I'm going to specify rubygems.org as a source for where I'm going to pull this gem from. And I'm going to return to the command line and run bundle install to make sure that everything is working correctly. Now, RMagick installs correctly because ImageMagick is installed on my system. You may need to install ImageMagick on your system in whatever the way that can be installed, brew or a package grab or an installation of an executable. Now I'm going to create our meme.rb file, which is going to contain the code that's allow us to get started. I'm going to require the RMagick gem. And then I'm going to put a few little put statements at the beginning that says habitization started and a habitization complete. And this is just going to give us a little message to make sure that everything is working correctly. Here I'm going to execute my code within my gems from my gem list using the bundle exec command, and I see that everything is working correctly. So let's talk about the pieces necessary to make this animated gem or animated image GIF file. First and foremost, I'm going to need a background image. Then I'm going to need a subject which I can lay over, eventually moving down. And then I'm going to need a front image, something to create that effect that I want. Right? Without the front image, I'm really just floating up above and around the vat or the container. The front here allows it or gives the impression with the translucency to create like the idea that I'm actually moving into the glass and of course descending into the liquid itself. I will provide these images for this project, but you're welcome to use any of your own. All right, so I'm going to start by loading those images using ImageMagick. So for ImageMagick, I need to load a back image, and I'm going to use ImageMagick's module constant and then use the image list. Here you specify the path to a file name. I have one called back.png. I'm going to load a subject image, or whatever, in this case it's going to be me, and then I'm going to load a front image, essentially the front that's going to go in front of that. I'm going to rerun this quickly just to make sure I've got all my constants correct and that my paths are correctly defined, that my files are able to be found. Wonderful. So now let's look at how we're going to accomplish this with RMagick. RMagick has an image or image list class, and it has in particular a lot of methods that are available to us. The one that we're interested in is the composite method. So the composite method allows us to essentially specify a destination image and then a source that is going to be placed over top of it or layered on top of it. You can think of it almost like a Photoshop file. In this case, the destination is here, and then this would be the source that's being placed on top. You see here is the method in which we can call it. So I'm going to copy this code into our code here. Our destination in this case is our back image, our composite method. Our source image is our subject. Now the gravity is what gets interesting. Our gravity is where we want to anchor the image when we want to lay it on top. We can choose different positions. I think the easiest one for us right now is the center gravity. So I'm going to use the Magick module constant and use center gravity. I want this in the absolute center, so I'm going to use 0, 0, so offset from that center. And then finally, the composite operator. So the composition, how it lays over top of it, is very similar to Photoshop when you specify all its sort of difference or exclusion or subtraction, right? We can sort of play with these different sort of ways in which they're composited together. In our case, we just want something that overlays over top of it, and that's where the over composite operator comes into play. So I'll use the magic constant and use the essentially over composite operator. Now this returns a new image is what it's saying, so I'm going to say subject over back equals the result of this operation. And I want to do this same thing for the front. I want to take the front over the subject over back, or let's just call it the final. We're going to take the subject over back. We're going to composite that, and here I'm just going to copy this whole method because I'm really going to do the same thing, except, well, instead of the subject, I want the composited subject over back right here. And then I want to lay it in the center at the exact same position with the over composite, and then I'm going to say final.write our final.gif right here. All right, let's run our code and let's see the result of this. So this quickly generates a final.gif file for us. And if you're surprised like I am, final equals subject, oh, I said subject over back, excuse me. This should be front right here. Oh, sorry, no, it should be subject over back with the front over top, right? Let's rerun this again and see the result of it. Now, this should probably be a little weird still, right? If you notice here, the subject image is much larger than the other image. I have a way to illustrate this here in Photoshop. So what happens is it wrote the back image, we wrote the subject image, and you notice it's really big, and then we wrote the front image. So that's kind of like what's going on here. And the reason for that is that the jar itself, the sort of background image, is only about 186 pixels in width. If you look at our subject file, or at least my subject file, it's about 960 by 1280. And what we want to do is dynamically resize it. Essentially, we want to set up the ratio to resize this. So what we want is 186, essentially for the pixel width, but we want a new value for its height. So we got to change this. There is a method that allows us to do that. There's a method called, in this case, adaptive resize. So the adaptive resize allows us to specify a new width and height. So let's return back to our code and resize our subject image. So let's change this to resize subject. This is going to be equal the adaptive resize. So in this case, I'm going to say subject adaptive resize. The new width is going to be 186 pixels. We might actually call that out and just say the new width, right, instead of hard coding that. And we might even call it like the jar width or something. Now here, the new height is something that we're going to calculate. Now here, if you remember your cross multiply and divide as far as like ratios, this is the resulting application. 186 pixels times the subject rows divided by the subject columns is going to give us the new height that we want. Now rows and columns are essentially the way that ImageMagick calls essentially its X, Y, or height and width. So that's what we're going to do here. So it's going to be 186 is the new height, so it's going to be the new width, right, times the subject.rows divided by the subject.columns. And then we're going to use that new height here. And of course, we save out a new image, which is going to be stored at resize subject. And I'm going to use the resize subject here. And let's rerun that code to make sure that everything is working correctly. Bundle exec ruby meme.rb. Seems like we have a misspelling here. I forgot an N in my columns. And the final result should be an updated image that shows me swimming in the container, which is great. It's just not animated. So let's talk a little bit on how we can animate this. And I'm going to return back to the original Photoshop image. So to animate this, we need to determine an initial position, a final position, and then, let's turn the front on just to kind of give the initial position, final position, and then the amount of frames that we want to do that. I'm just going to come up with some arbitrary values. This is where you can figure out what you want to do. All right, so let's say what we want to do then is to say, let's say the number of frames we want are 20 frames. The distance between each frames or the movement we want is 10 pixels, so 10 per frame. and the essentially starting position, the start position of the image. In our case, that's for us to figure out how much we want. I'm just going to say let's move one height of the image up. So I'm going to say the image is going to be the resize subject, and we're going to say let's move the number of rows. Remember, that's essentially the height of the thing. Looking back at this image right here, the number of rows, subject.rows here. So that's going to give us our start position, but we don't want that positive, because if we anchor to the center, a positive value is going to send it down. We want to negative that so that it essentially goes up. Now, we want to look at the number of frames times do the index. So it's going to give us a loop that's going to iterate over this. We're going to create this here. We say the subject over back. We have our final image. And we can't really write out a final dot one because that's going to replace every single time. So we're going to change this. Let's just call it frame. And we'll include the index value. And we'll use a GIF suffix here to essentially create each frame of the index to kind of verify it. We want to figure out not an offset for the x, but an offset for the y. Let's calculate that. So the offset is going to be the start position plus the index, whatever that index value is, times the movement. So first and foremost, this is going to be 0. Oh, sorry, yeah, 0. And this is going to be 10. And this is going to be 1 and 2 and 3 and eventually 19. So we're going to get essentially this moving down. So again, we'll come back to the original values here. And I'm going to use the offset here. Now this is going to write out every single frame as hopefully a file. Here we are. I'm going to return to the file. So here we are, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way out to 19. So now we have all these individual images. We just need to stitch them together. And the way that we can do that is actually using the image list class again. But this time we're not going to load a file. We're just going to create a new one without a file. So let's create an animation, which is going to be an magic image list.new. And we're going to insert every one of those images into this animation, and then we're going to write out this animation at the end. So this animation is going to write out, and we'll just call this the final.gif. All right, great. So let's rerun this again, and we should see an animation that looks probably about right. So here we are. Here's a final.gif. So it's almost perfect, except we see a little bit of artifacting going on. And to explain this a little bit is that when we use an image list, there is this thing called optimization of layers. So there's an optimization choice that ImageMagick is using to optimize the layers. And what it assumes for us is it assumes that we want to keep some of the previous sort of image or artifacting going on in the previous frames of this animation. For us, we don't want that, so we want to remove some of those images. So the interesting thing is we want to use this optimize plus layer as the value of the optimized layers. So let's return back to our code, specify our animation, and we're going to optimize the layers, and we're going to specify magic : optimize plus layer, and we need to save this actually and do this before we save it. We need to assign this to a new value. I'm just going to assign it upon itself and then write this out as a final thing. We execute this again, we see the result, and we see our final image, and everything looks great. Now we might want to add just a last image, a pause on the last image to create sort of the final result that we want to make this sort of impact of like, wow, we see yourself in the liquid in this case. So I'm going to grab the last image and I'm going to specify a delay, and you can specify a different value here. If you look back at the content, there is a way you can specify delay, how much time you want, ticks per second that you want to see. In this case, I specified 200 for that last image, and I think the result should be exactly what we're hoping for. All right, wonderful. So in the next exercise, we're going to turn this into a website that allows us to specify any subject image that gets resized and put in here, and then we'll easily deliver this into production using Habitat.